Welcome all, and really thanks for joining us this afternoon on our conversation about managing people risk. I'm sure it's a hot topic to everyone, and we're delighted to have 4 speakers today. First of all, I'm the Interim Managing Director of Research at the Global Risk Institute. I have the pleasure to be the host and the chair of this session today. And from left to right, we have Nancy Gower, from the head of People and Culture at CDIC. We have Carol Ann Noscott, the Chief Risk Officer at Central One Credit Union. We have Dr. Talia Varley, the physician lead for advisory services at Cleveland Clinic Canada. And last but not least, Rodney Hill, former CRO, head of global head of technology, data, and security at OMERS, to join us today. Maybe a bit more about the speakers today. Talia is the co-author of our recent publication titled Managing People Risk, a growing opportunity and challenge in 2023 and ahead. The study is based on a people risk survey we conducted some time ago, in which Nancy, Carol Ann, and Rodney participated as well. And today we're having a very open and interactive conversation on people risk management, really to to share some of the study findings from the survey and to address the gaps in when it comes to people risk management, and share strategies to really effectively manage people risk. And hopefully this can be applied to all the organizations of your company. So really during the session, really feel free to raise your hand, jump right into the conversation. We're trying to make it really interactive. There are 2 handheld mics that my colleague is having. So if you can raise your hand, feel free to be seated, or you want to stand up, that's fine. And maybe we try to speak up loud, or using one of the microphones so everyone can hear you. And this is also for the recording purposes. They can have a better sound effect. But really looking forward to all of the speakers to share insights today with us, and really hoping to hear the stories from all of you guys as well. All right, so first of all, I think many of you, when you saw the agenda, our session title, Managing People Risk in the Post-COVID World, you might have a really curious moment of what is people risk? Is that just a different, is that the same as just a different term for talent risk? Or is that just completely different from talent risk? I'm sure some of you might have that question. So maybe first of all, Talia, I'll ask you, maybe walk us through how the people risk is defined in your study, and maybe share us a bit how the people risk survey was conducted.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me here today. So people risk is quite broad, and it has a lot of different definitions, but in terms of how we looked at it for the survey and for our interviews, we really defined it with that breadth in mind. So it covers everything from health and safety, to benefits and compensation, to talent retention, attrition risks, and the like. And interestingly, even if you look at Mercer data, their data would tell you that 87% of companies see things like health and safety of their employees as being one of the biggest and most material risks that organizations face today. And it covers some of the obvious things, right? Things like COVID, like pandemics, but it also covers some of the less obvious things that might not always, come to the fore day to day, but really signal fundamental issues that we need to tackle over the multi-year, multi-decade horizon. So that could be things on physical health, whether it's on chronic diseases like heart disease. It could also be on the mental health side. We also look at things like workforce burnout in that definition. And then broadly, as you go to other areas, as you think about talent in general, it could even be things around hybrid work, remote workforce risks. It could cover areas of sustainability, things around climate change, things around DEI. And so with that in mind, with regards to our survey, we ended up serving a couple of dozen Canadian FIs. This was across the retail banks, insurers, asset managers, pension funds. And we also did a series of one-on-one interviews with very strong CROs like Rodney here prior to him moving into
Karen also participated.
in the tech role. And then we also interviewed chief HR officers, sustainability officers to really get a nice sprinkling of different insights from various functions across the executive team.
Thanks, Talia. Because I'm sure there are a lot of people risk or talent risk surveys, but I think we're one of the few ones that actually conducted through a chief officer or executive's perspective and really have that interview with them. Yeah, so I hope that addressed some of the question mark in your head. And next, I think we're at the year 2023, and if you think of COVID-19, it's been 4 years. I can't believe it. So 4 years, I'm sure pandemic has changed a lot of things that in our lives, with our understanding of risk being one of them, and there are so many lessons, valuable lessons that our organizations can learn from. How we can learn from the pandemic so we can better prepare for similar disruptions in the future. So perhaps the next question is for all of panelists here, that when it comes to how much attention that people risk have really captured during COVID and after COVID, I'm sure there are a lot of changes in leadership requirements and capabilities. And what's your perspective and what have you observed in your organization?
Maybe
Sure.
I'll start and it's a very big question. Okay. I think the first part is that, it's stating the obvious that the way we worked before and the way we work today is completely different, right? And the acceptability of the flexibility of working, I think, is actually very different today than it was before. But before I came to OMERS, I was at an accounting firm, and I was used to spending 80% of my time with clients, and always I used to joke that my office was my portable bag, and I would go to Starbucks and wherever, and it seems to be that is actually now normal for how we do. So I think the core, if we talk about hybrid work, and that's an emotive topic, and I think it's just the reality is it's here to stay in some way, shape, or form. I think really the most important part of it is that it's who you work with. And I think the people manager you have and that environment that you work within, I think is the single most important that affects the work life of many people, that actually affects their longevity, that affects turnover and many other things. The further out you get from that immediate group that you actually have, I think the less impact it actually has on the individual. So you can have a macro policy to do X or Y, but the reality of it, I think those small groups are the things that I would say I'm paying a lot more attention to. The reason why it's interesting I'm here today is I've gone from leading a rather, I would say small, but highly motivated and very capable risk team to leading a very large technology team we're at least 250 plus people, plus contractors, and it's a very different management experience for me versus what it was before. And it's interesting about how I'm trying to create the culture in the team of getting people feeling as though they're belonging. And it's just physically difficult to do that sometimes because of that's still not even that large a group, I'm sure, versus some of the other large FIs. But I will tell you that, and we are a pension plan, and we do invest in real estate, and our CEO is a real estate CEO. So it would but would not be hard to realize that he sort of likes offices and likes being in offices because it's his business. So you can imagine that there's a certain reality of asking people to come into the office. So there was a guy who's come in at a sort of like a director level for us, and he's worked at one of the banks for a period of time, and he said for about the last 5 years he's always been remote, even before the pandemic, and we're now making him come into the office 4 days a week, and he's really enjoying it because he's a place that he belongs. He actually can walk around the hall and talk to people, and he feels as though it's actually great. So that's only one data point. But I think the question of people risk is dramatically different than it was before. I think the things that were our focus before are completely different today. And I think we have to pay much more attention, I think, to that individual work experience and actually give people the permission to choose how they want to work, frankly, within boundaries and within limits and all that sort of good stuff. But I think that's what people want, and you can't take it away now.
Can I just grab
Yeah.
a couple things in? Because I mean, I think that's where we are.
Yeah.
Like hands down. So let's just take that as a fact and as a given. And I think what was really interesting, part of that is then how does leadership and capabilities need to change? Because you mentioned about that core being the leader, like that first manager. And when I think about what's really changed in this pandemic and this whole new way of working and this, let's presume actually that you're not going to be face-to-face. You're going to set your whole leadership style in a world where in the past it was face-to-face and now it's not. And not only is it not face-to-face, but it might be flexible for everyone, right? There might not even be consistency in how this is. And when I think about that, how things have changed, what I find really interesting is I don't think it's the what around leadership that's changed, but it's the how. So when you think about, what you need to do to be a good leader, when I think about people who are being onboarded, well, you would bring them in and how do you train them up and how do you build relationships and how do you think about succession planning and development? I think in the old world, it's hard to be a good manager anyway in the old world, but many of us did it by personal connection, by walking the room and seeing people and connecting with them. You onboarded people by setting them up with someone to shadow and said, just hang out with them for a couple months and then you'll figure it out and then we'll give you your own job. Succession planning, you get around as executives and you talk about people. Well, half of them you never knew. You only knew because you bumped into them in the halls or you saw them. And now all of a sudden we're in a world where, as a leader, to make those same things happen, you have to be much more intentional. You can't rely on serendipity that you're going to bump into them in the morning and remember to, I'm going to explain that to them when I see them, or pair someone up, a shadowing, because it doesn't work anymore. It's a radically different way, a more intentional way of managing and of leading. Mm-hmm. And that just, to be honest, is a whole lot more work, right? It's a whole lot more for the managers to have to manage through that. And then are you finding your managers being really pressed?
I think that many people aspire to be a people manager. And I think one of the things is that I don't think everybody should be. But I also think that people equate that into hierarchy and pay and compensation.
That's true.
And I don't think necessarily that the individuals that are very good subject matter expertise-wise may be terrible people managers, but that doesn't necessarily, to me, equate into compensation per se.
Yeah.
So there are places where I've been able to separate out people that we think are very good at a subject matter, take away a lot of the day-to-day people management because they're just not good at it. Mm-hmm. And to your point, the other thing I think is an honest challenge today is that, I know in my background, I was always very mobile and very flexible in how I work, right? Look, today, I couldn't, for a family reason, I couldn't make it into work, and we had a meeting starting at 9. I started that meeting for the first half hour, chairing the meeting remotely, walking up the elevator and walking into the room. That's completely acceptable today, whereas before it would have been frowned upon. But I do think there are some people who struggle with that flexibility.
It's tough.
And I think that is a demand that people are looking for today.
I think you need that in your leaders now to be able to handle that flexibility. Yeah.
But I think I do agree with you. You have to be, so I'm in the process, the reason why I'm saying it's really hard, there's 250 people. I'm going to meet every single person one-on-one between, I started in the summer, but vacation got in the way, but
In
between
person,
now and the end of November, I will meet every single person
You're doing
between
better than me.
one-on-one.
I'm not anywhere near it. I have a fraction. You're doing very
Between
well.
now-
You're doing very well.
But it's hard, but it's
It is.
really physically,
Yeah.
I did it before in the risk team, but we did it generally about twice a year. It was easy to do it. It was 10, 15 minutes, like speed dating. But it was great to meet people one-on-one. It was really cool, actually. So.
And if I can interject, a couple of things that you're kind of hearing here is, it did really require us to pivot from our changed behaviors of our everyday norms. And underlining here, I think what I'm hearing Carol Ann say and Rodney say is there's a renewed focus on soft skill development. And those are not easy skills to develop. It takes practice, it takes intention to do it, and it takes genuine interest in the people you're working with to be able to do that. So I think that's the renewed focus that pandemic has really brought to the forefront is we were all going through this together. We lost people we knew. This was hard. We were entering a new era of mental health crisis, and we said 2 weeks we'll be back to work. 36 months later, and we're still trying to kind of navigate those pieces. So I think that's the biggest change is there's a renewed focus. We've always known that this was important, but now we're really double downing on soft skill development for our leaders.
And it has to be rewarded. Like it's kind of the bridging that gap. I mean, why do you need to be a people manager to progress and get higher salaries? Like there's a skill over here that's important and technical, and there's a skill over here that's important. And they both should have a path.
Yeah, I think that's a very well connected to, like, Nancy, you mentioned the mental health risk and, also physical health risk. I think Talia is really the expert addressing this because we saw in the survey results there's a really increasingly attention on like managing people risk on health risk for employees, customers, all the people you interact with. Can you share some of that? What's been what have you seen has been changed and in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think even today's conversation is really realizing top down, we need to reset expectations, and bottom up, the expectations have already leapfrogged us, right? So if we think about employee expectations, investor, customer, regulator expectations, they are all elevated, and significantly so in an accelerated way coming out of COVID. And so we think about employees and the foundations of our organizations. They want and are demanding more, and they want it to be more holistic, right? So it's not just I want this or I want that, it's I want total well-being support, physical, financial, mental, social health. How are you taking care of me as an individual, right? And so when we think about the social contract with employees and organizations, in some ways the gig economy sort of shifted a bit of that dynamic. And I think we're coming back to this social contractual engagement with employees around, employees finding their sense of home, cultural norms, their center and community in their companies. And that comes alongside it with, you have to take care of me as an entire individual. And so whether someone is new to your organization and they are a Gen Z, first, job, LGBTQ employee, or whether they are a mid-tenure Black female employee, those are two very, very different employee profiles. And so as much as we have employees demanding more in this sort of total well-being picture, we also have to get smarter and more sophisticated at how do we address what total well-being means for these different segments of our employees. And I think historically we had looked a lot at things like geography, cultural norms in Canada, in parts of Asia and Europe, but now it's actually about hyper-segmentation. Right, alongside things like gender, ethnicity, different experiences, different expectations, even on things like mental health. There's a difference between need, but also expectation of being able to have a sense of psychological safety on your team, engage in topics in different ways.
So now you have to help me out because you say this, and I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like, yes, like I have an autistic daughter I have a gay autistic daughter, right? So that's on my one extreme, and then I have my other daughter who's on the extreme, what you would call normal. Right, like she's white, heterosexual. Like we got two different extremes happening, and so on one hand, I'm like, yes, I want all that heterogeneity. I want all of it. And then the risk side of me goes, right, simplify. How do you get simple? How do you're setting up, which is a really interesting thing I hadn't thought about before, is how do you manage that complexity that comes with managing the heterogeneity with how you do things in a way that's sustainable and simple and effective. Now you've just asked a question I don't know how to answer anymore. So that was super interesting. Yeah.
So I think it's also led into we had a bit of a conversation before the panel started on even where does this sit? Who owns this? And it's such a dynamic question because as it gets harder and more complex and bigger, it also means that all of a sudden you start to annex different parts of different leaders' portfolios. And then it gets confusing. Even if you have enough people who want to own it, how do you actually decide how to move forward and who owns which pieces?
Well, I'm going to own it if it works well,
Yeah.
and if it doesn't work well, then the HR people own it.
I will
very easy.
respectfully
I like
disagree.
that.
Very strategic. Yeah.
It sounds like a good survey.
Yeah. Talia mentioned like like in our survey results when we look at it after we got all the responses, and there's something very interesting we find. There seems to be a lack of ownership, like you just mentioned, like who owns people risk, like who's in charge of handling people risk in a big organization, whether big or small. And could you share some like stats from our survey results, and maybe potentially on a high level talk about what do you recommend, like how do we address them? I'm going to start with you, share some stats, and then we'll go to the rest of the speakers and share your insights in your organization.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, quite frankly, a lot of the research on people risk that we led across GRI and Cleveland Clinic really started with a scenario at one of the banks, which was, hey, on boots on the ground during COVID, you saw incredible collaboration across risk and HR. And yet when all of that work around COVID response and contact tracing, as soon as that bubbled up to the executive team, where did the conversation happen? It happened in HR. And why? Why is that? Why did it get reflected that way? Was that historical? Was it intentional? And some of it was actually just about, really recognizing that from a governance standpoint, there's still a lot of open question marks around where these types of elements sit. And COVID was just such an extreme example that it really made it pretty plain as day. But we still don't, I think to your point, have the best answer around it. But I can tell you that from our survey data, CROs were split. Right? When we think about the lines of defense, first, second, third was quite clear, but first and second line, the real question mark was where does HR go, right? So business line clearly would potentially be first line, risk would clearly be second line, but HR sort of straddled the two. And so I think even through the interviews, there was a lot of conversation, and we even had dyads of interviews of HR and risk partners at the same organizations, and you got really diverse perspectives. Even where HR and risk felt that they were collaborating, partnering quite closely or maybe less closely, they still had quite different perspectives on what would happen in terms of this evolution of the governance model and that ownership over time, sort of now versus 5 or 10 years from now, sort of similar to where technology would have been with the CTO and cyber risk.
Look, I think, I'll stick my neck, despite my joking, is that to me, it's like the hard part about many organizations is easy when it's black and white, right? Here or there, first or second or third. It's when it gets in that messy gray area, it gets difficult. So fundamentally, you have to have people that actually can see and be more synchronized. I like using the word like synchronize across an organization. Mm-hmm. To me, the people risk is clearly owned by the people managers. Like the individuals who actually are accountable for running teams. That is where the people risk belongs, and that's where it's owned. I think that the human resource team and the risk team play slightly different roles. I think the role we played at OMERS from an HR perspective, or people risk, is we set a very, very big picture viewpoint about what we wanted to measure and why. And I shared some of this with you. And then we actually engaged the HR team to actually be able to actually conduct those measurements and actually then be able to tell a story or explain if we're seeing attrition of this, if we're seeing turnover of this, why is that? How does that break down? And that is now, in my new role today, that's now coming to me as a functional owner, giving me insight into the people risk that I own as a technology team. So I really encourage us to think through the word of synchronization, because it's never as simple as X or Y. It's always more complex than that.
Indeed.
I don't really, there's a way, in one way, I don't see how this is any different from any other risk, right? Risk is always owned in the business. Always, 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 always. And you mentioned CISOs, that was a good example, as is any other area where it's big enough that it needs another second line of defense beyond ERM. So you can think about financial reporting as well. There's lots of places where you have this other second line in there as well. When I think of it, you said it so well, right? It's owned by the manager.
Yeah.
HR owns a profound responsibility around developing many of the mitigations around people risk, right? The policies, the processes, the health and the safety, leadership, development, recruiting, like those are all mitigations to a people risk, and HR owns them. We also have some oversight, compliance has some. And I think of myself from a risk perspective, I get to look across all of that. And I get to really, I think my fundamental role, where I provide the most value, is in helping to identify the people risks and helping to help the business and HR connect the dots on the mitigations. Yes, I have some oversight as well, but to be honest, not as much as in other areas. I mean, but to me, this is no different from any other risk, but somehow it does feel hard. It feels a bit more like we kind of push ourselves. Where does it sit? Who does it? It's actually like everything else. It has to be a joint effort, right? It has to be that conversation that cuts across. So I don't know why it's so hard. Why is it so hard, Nancy? Why is this?
Here's the $1 million question.
Wow.
Before you say, but I just say one thing. I have seen a lot of people sort of say, well, that's not my accountability, that's HR. And I think that's the challenge with the HR team, because they get pushed into that role, but it isn't their role because somebody's abdicating their responsibility.
I sometimes have financial risk teams on the first line try to launch that at me too, right? Like, can you go do the modeling? Actually, that's yours. So again, it's true. It's just, it's not fundamentally different, I guess. I don't know.
I think when you kind of peel back a layer on that, the hard part is getting to the right metrics. What you're trying to measure are intangibles. Those are never easy to really get to and quantify. And then you've got to raise up the portfolio and kind of report on these types of things. We're fortunate at CDIC that we work very collaboratively with our enterprise risk management group to ensure that the metrics we are using are the right metrics for CDIC, tell the story of what we need to focus on and what's the correlation of where we need to put our most efforts to improve areas. So I think it's really about that uncomfortableness. Think about setting goals. Nobody likes to set goals. They're hard. Nobody likes to measure them. It's the same thing for metrics. What are the right people metrics
Right.
when you're looking at people risk? I think people struggle with that piece.
I agree.
Now that you mentioned that, can I just quickly probe a bit further? Like, what are the key indicators or metrics that CDIC is using? If you don't mind sharing when it comes
Well,
to
I have my
people
function
risk
back here.
management.
They can help me. No. I think we're not ready to move away from traditional metrics. So attrition metrics are still very important to us right now, especially in this tight labor market. But where we've really focused on is voluntary attrition, and of that voluntary attrition, how many less than 5 years are leaving, how many of those voluntary attritions out are my top performers that I really wanted to have that stay conversation with, and I didn't, and I lost that opportunity. Needing to look at overall vacancy rate. Do I have the resources on hand in the event that something happens within the financial industry and I have to enact my mandate and respond? So we look at those particular capabilities. And then when we look at culture and wellness, this is more when you're looking at those intangible things that are hard to measure. It's really about trying to get a pulse on employee sentiment. Would my employees advocate that CDIC is a great place to work? So yes, we like the Net Promoter Score. I think it says a lot about the organization. Are my employees proud about the work they do? Do they take value in the work that they do? Would that give us that good sentiment there as well? Mental health, do they feel they can go to their manager? Is there a sense of safety? Do they have good team engagement, and is there good teamwork? So we rely on the survey uses for that, and there's so many more metrics we use, and I think there's an abundance of it. It's really about what we bring up for visibility to our leadership team and our board, and we're fortunate that our board's very interested in our people metrics and want us to be set up to ensure that our mitigation efforts are achieving the outcomes. Are we telling the right story, and are we focused on where we're gonna get the best results for us? You can't boil the ocean. There's a lot of things out there that you could do. It's about what's unique to your organization at the time you're in right now.
Sounds good. Nancy, I'm gonna dive right in here, Rodney, because given your dual role of former CRO and the global head, like what's your take from a technology perspective?
I was just looking at my watch. There's a conversation that's been happening for the last 2 hours, and what is the implication of AI, and what's the strategy for AI with a human resource group? And I do have to say is that we actually have to put some ethics in front of this, but I'm going to give you some examples. So you today, before going into this meeting tomorrow, I was talking to a guy in HR, and we were saying, I said, what are you really trying to achieve? He says, what I really would love to know, Rodney, is are you likely to leave the organization, and what is the risk of that? Like, and I say, well, we were brainstorming, how could you actually do that? What data sets exist? How you can connect those data sets? And what sort of analysis could you actually get out of that to truly do that? You can actually take, most of us are Microsoft 365. You can actually take all of that email traffic that's actually happening. You can put these language models on top of it, and you can actually ask these questions of it, and you can come up with an answer. The question is really interesting, and there's a broader question in technology that we're dealing with right now, is that should we, right? But I think this is the forefront of what's going to happen in human resources. So really getting, what do you truly care about? There is so cutting edge technology that actually can get at these things, but the underlying data as well is very difficult in terms of knowing if it's reliable, if it's predictable, and should you actually, can you imagine if you thought that your email was being evaluated? It can be done today. So you can actually take it today and you can say, what's the sentiment from the email, and at what level you're willing to do that, and are you willing to, as an individual, how would you feel if your email is being monitored that way? Even though the policy says, most of our policies, if you go and read them technology-wise, say you have no right to privacy in your personal emails at work. You have no right to it. So I think that is going to be the next cutting edge, because you could get some incredibly interesting insights in terms of the risks that reside in the human resources group. I think there are things that you can do, but you have to really construct them very carefully to make sure we're not stepping over that line into a real clear invasion of privacy. But that's a live conversation. Scary.
Yeah.
And
Sounds-
interesting, all at the same time.
It's a lot of things to balance at the same time, and you need to be careful. Then you mentioned AI. Like, there are so many things that AI can do, but there are so many risks associated with AI as well.
Yeah, so like it's like right now, one of my concerns is that, and then like again, coming from the risk background, is that I don't think we currently have the guardrails set up to know how we would actually do it. I don't have the confidence yet to know that even if a technology team develops something, what review is that in fact going to go through? So we're actively really trying to figure that out right now, and what is our broad strategy? So I mean, this in all of your organizations, this is a live conversation, but you will get to many areas a much richer insight into information is what you're going to get if you can frame the correct question and if you understand the way it's constructed. But there's a risk here, which I think from an individual perspective is that, like, I've accepted that my cell phone is anything I put in my email, I know is fair game. I know that. But does everybody know that? Do they expect that? Do they have an expectation of privacy? We've got these things in the office right now monitoring usage. I hate it. Like, I feel as though I'm getting monitored at work.
Getting spied. Right?
Going back to this hybrid work environment, which is, I've just been given the privilege to choose how I want to work. Do you want to be at home in the morning, in the office in the afternoon? And I think that's what most people actually want. And then to do that, and then have this friggin' thing in the office monitoring me when I come in and I'm not. Now I have to figure out, how does it measure it? If I set a dummy in my office that actually, with a motorized thing that flaps arms, does that actually count towards the metric or not count towards the metric? I have thought about this.
As I say, now we understand how Rodney thinks around the mitigations.
Yeah, so I'm sure that you guys are thinking about this, but I think that's going to really change.
Sounds, Rodney, you mentioned some privacy issues, or like there's some trust behind it. I think I'm gonna ask Carolyn to share your insights, because trust and stability is really key to the credit union sector. And in Central One, could you share your experience or your insights of some of the key measurement or indicators that you guys look at?
Yeah, trust is important for everyone. So and you guys have said it already so well, so I don't want to so everything you said, yes, and then we're not quite there, but it's super interesting, and maybe the link might be, because where AI could be really just so profoundly useful is to help us get at the qualitative bits. So right now, the way we all try to do this is through surveys. And in a similar sort of way, you have to come up with the right question, and what does the survey mean? So when we think about people risk, the qualitative, the sentiment, is as important as the hard metric. So that's a really interesting place where that would go. And then maybe the only thing I would add, just looking at time, I really love those metrics that are really tied to mitigations, the things that can help you be key risk indicators. So for me, things around development, who's being developed, what kind of development is it, are they actively engaged, succession planning. I mean, that could just be, you could think about that as a management exercise, but understanding how deep your ladders are, how much people are on multiple ladders because you've developed them in a cross-functional way, key people risk. So in addition to the ones you mentioned, I really like those metrics that look like they're tied to a business process or good management process, but they actually tell you a lot about how you're positioning yourself in the future with respect to your leadership team and your expertise and that sort of stuff. So maybe it's kind of bridging the gap between the two.
Thanks, Carolyn.
I want to comment on the succession planning piece because I think it's so important for a few reasons. I think in the short term, sort of the next few years, we've seen, and I've heard a lot of CHROs shared this, highly, highly surprising attrition. And sometimes at the most senior levels of organizations, and quite often related to carefully crafted DEI pipelines that are obliterated within a matter of a few very specific people choosing to either fully exit the workforce early, right, early unexpected retirement, or making a move to sometimes a completely different industry, right? So a lot of things could be behind that, but one of the things I want to highlight is just the real change in terms of how people are thinking about their lives, longevity, their personal and professional sort of harmonization of goals. And so I think just expecting a bit more of that unexpected and planning for that and monitoring that will be critical in the short term, especially as we get to these, sometimes these 2025, 2026 DEI goals that are coming due for a number of organizations that might be in this room today. But on the other side, in terms of the future of work, so that sort of macro succession planning of who are the next generation of leaders of our organization. I think there's a lot of conversation there on the Gen Z cohort and how we need to actually cultivate talent differently. There's a lot of the themes that you shared earlier.
If we had time, I don't know where I haven't paid attention to timing, but I'd be super interested from Nancy about, because succession planning, there's doing it well, and there's a whole range in between. I'm not even sure I know what well is, because the risk of succession planning is that as leaders you become very narrowly focused on just those people you know, and then you start, like that's the net downside of it, but then to bring people through it and help them understand where they are. So maybe if you have one or two tips on good succession planning.
Yeah, a good succession plan.
Yeah, of course.
For sure.
Because it really does manage risk if you do it well.
Yeah, I think don't be boxed into looking just inside. Understand who's in your network, because sometimes you might be bringing people outside your organization to fill key critical roles, and that's often where I've seen more success in my HR career, because as Talia alluded to, a lot of people are taking themselves out of the labor market. They've changed career paths. I think the way our workforce, or how we know the workforce today, is going to change significantly in the next 5 years. It's the first time now we have 5 different generations working with us. So to Talia's point too, how you communicate, how you develop people are going to be very different depending on what you're targeting. So I think for succession planning can't be also just something you dust off one time out of the year. It needs to have rigor. It needs to have it needs to be a rinse and repeat at a quite different frequency, just because things change and people leave. So you do need to have them almost like your business continuity planning in your back pocket, ready to kind of pull out.
Interesting.
Yeah. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Carolyn. So one challenge, I think Ronnie, you touched on this earlier as well, is the challenge many organizations are facing that have their employees coming back to the office and work there. I'm sure many of you here probably work hybrid, like a few days in the office, few days home, few days like Rodney before travel on site meeting with clients. So what's your insights, or could you share your tips or advice on how organizations can better manage that transition back to return to the office?
I think one thing you have to do is just be clear about what you expect. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of one of the complications I'm dealing with is that we have a very broad organization. Part of the organization runs a call center, which a large proportion of the group, and they've sort of said, quite rightly, I think that call center can work remotely 4 days out of 5, but 1 day a week in the office. Sort of makes sense because, long story. Yet the rule for my team is 3 to 4 days a week in the office, and there's envy between the two. And so I think that just being very clear about what you expect, number one. And the other thing I do think is about, I do believe I embrace flexibility. So to me, the way I've tried to articulate it, and I think this is right for me and my team, is look, I just expect you to spend the majority of the time in the office. You have to decide if it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday and Friday. Like, you figure that out. Is it half a day every day? Because I personally want to have the choice as to what flexibility means to me. I don't want it to be mandated. You have to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the office, and by the way, you come Thursday. I just don't think you can do that. That's what I believe. So
that's, can I just grab that? Because that's super, so, because the other side of that is, like, for me, the only reason I want to go into work, the only meaningful reason to go into work for me is that there are people there who you want to brainstorm, like people you're going to work with, because I work almost 100% remote now. I hate every second of it. I much prefer to be in the office with people, because I find, especially as a risk person, the one-on-one connection makes things easier. Like, you just work through problems faster. So I only want to go into the office if other people are in the office. To me, it's checking a box if I show up on a Monday. I've done my 1 day a week, but no one's there. It was not good for me. So this is the divide, right? Like, do you let people do it flexibly? You have a big enough organization that you probably got enough people coming in regardless.
and there's also a critical mass.
Yeah, you
because
need that critical mass.
and there is a little bit. I turn up every day.
Yeah.
So, and I'm new in my role. So if you're sort of smart, you're going to think about it. You've got a new boss. Do you do it remotely, or do you come into the office? So it sort of sets a bit of a tone. So
Yeah.
I think you have to be, going back to, this is a question about people leaders, I think you have to be very aware of the behavior that you exhibit, because that is the behavior. It's like having kids, right? If you scream and yell all the time, the kids will start to scream and yell. So your behavior as a leader is incredibly important.
So it sounds like you believe the benefit of FaceTime, really connecting in person, one-on-one. Nancy, I'm sure at the head of the people and culture, you have a lot to say on this front.
I do, and it's a very hot topic. I would say hybrid is here to stay in whatever shape or form that your organization decides to take with it. But I think pandemic has proven that in the last 3 years, we've been able to collaborate virtually. We've figured it out. So I think when you land on what your hybrid strategy is going to be, it has to be really purpose-based. It has to meet that employee need. Because we talked about that shift between the relationship between the employer and the employee. Employees want flexibility, autonomy. That's not going to go away. Where do you find the sweet spot so that you have what you need to have, from getting your employees to buy in to what you're trying to achieve, contribute to your organizational objectives, and still are inclusive so that you're meeting the different demands for different groups. So I think it's an infinite struggle, but it requires attention and intention. It just can't be because I said so.
Yeah.
People are going to ask questions, and to Rodney's point, we need to be very clear and concise as to why we're going down this path.
Yeah. Otherwise, you just get bitter for having to come in.
No, I was able to say we're a pension plan and we invest in real estate. It is part of the reason why we're coming back,
Yeah.
because there's a business reason for it. So
Well, and
To
on the
support
flip
the
side, I'm remote because Essential One, we don't have a strong comeback.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some expectations, but most people are remote most of the time.
Yeah.
And so you do have to find different ways to bring people together and to do those things.
I know many banks actually sold their real estate property to the pension, but they're still trying to get people back to the office and really have that FaceTime.
no comment. I'm not in risk anymore. I don't have to worry about valuation.
Okay, I think we're heading towards the last bit of the session today, and really time to take out all your crystal balls and really looking ahead. And what do you think really lies ahead of us when it comes to managing people risk, and especially the challenges maybe your organization are facing, or any advice for some organizations are just started to incorporate this people risk into their overall risk management framework. Anyone want to jump in first? I know there's some very interesting results in the survey we did, Talia, I think there are like a lot of gaps we see that organizations still need to address. Ronnie?
I'll just say one thing, because I know I shared this with Talia, that when she interviewed me, is that when I came into my roles in risk, we didn't have an articulation of people risk. So to me, the most single important thing that we started from was starting to make it logically. We had compensation design, other things. And then the second thing we did was we put some metrics around it to start to measure it so we could actually have conversations. And that's where we work closely with the HR team to actually do those. I think if there's one thing I'd say is it is such a complex area, at least start with some sort of measurement capability so you can actually have an objective conversation.
Yeah, indeed.
I would just add that your people risks, like culture, should change over time. And you need to be prepared to be agile enough to change with it and to determine who is it you want to be? What are the behaviors you want to see so that you focus on getting the right type of outcomes? It should not be static.
So we did learn in the pandemic how to get things done. For sure we did. I don't think we've yet learned how to be as efficient, effective, creative, collaborative. We learned how to do Zoom calls and team calls. But my experience is we kind of held our breath and we relied on the networks we already had and the people we already knew. And now we're coming out of that and the turnover's been huge. And the real challenge of working remotely is how do you break out of silos? Because now you're encouraged to stay home and stay focused because I'm more productive, right? So you're kind of rewarded for that. But how do you break people out of their silos to remember to cross over to people they may have never met? You're going to send them a Teams chat? Like, really? That seems scary to people? Not to me, but it might be to people I send Teams chats to. I don't think we've figured this out yet. I think we've sent people home to work in their silos, and people say they're being more productive because they're churning out more stuff. And I ask myself, these new people, young people that are coming in, are we giving them what they need? This is the intention part. Are we giving them what they need to connect? Are we giving them what they need to grow? Am I going to look out 3 years from now and see someone who's been there for 3 years and they've barely known everybody in the company, they're not as tethered across the organization, they don't understand how these things link up? That's what I worry about, because I don't think we've got that sorted yet. I really don't.
The onboarding.
Well, not just, it's all of
employee.
it. It's the interconnectedness of it and the silos and the piece. And because there's a difference between being productive and being effective. And I feel like there's more we need to really think about. There's a radically, you said at the very beginning, Rodney, it's here to stay. So we can't just hold our breath and look for volume of output. We have to ask ourselves, are we getting better at doing it? And for me, that's where I have more growth.
I think you're right, because sometimes we say that, yes, I'm more productive, but is productivity in of itself the only goal?
When you're a knowledge worker, right? Like, what does that mean to be productive? What is the thing?
It means you should be using artificial intelligence and large language models. But we'll come back to that.
We'll go back to Neil. Yeah. Talia gets to quote.
Well, yes, and yes. And I think the common thread that I'm hearing across, all of our comments is there's a human element here, and we are talking about people risk. Yeah. And so it reminds me of an interesting maxim that Larry Summers actually shared, I think, as early as 2011, but really came up in the All-In Summit that was held in the last few weeks, which is, does achievement lead to self-esteem, or does self-esteem lead to achievement? And I feel that is really the crux of the type of problem that we are trying to solve together here, that really leads to these fundamental human elements that we really just need to acknowledge there are major gaps in almost any, if not every organization right now, touching these areas of people risk. So I think just acknowledging that those gaps are there, yes, getting metrics, yes, evolving that sort of people risk list, but also just thinking about how do I need to fill those gaps, and it's not always going to be internal to your organization. Just like cybersecurity, climate, you're going to need external experts, you're going to need your health advisor, you're going to need your behavioral econ advisor, but really figuring out where do you have those gaps in your company and how can you sometimes outsource or insource them will probably be what really defines some of those winners in the coming years.
Well said.
Wow. I'm going to direct that to the audience. Anyone want to go ahead, please? Do we have a mic?
Yeah, one comment and one question. First, to Nancy's comment about soft skills, Now, that's something that needs rebranding because they're remarkably hard.
Exactly.
Power skills is the new name.
And I was going to go down the road of behavioral science and predictive analytics, but I won't go there. I work in BMO's ethics office, so I'm concerned with conduct risk. OSPI now has us concerned about culture risk, integrity risk, behavior risk. So I go back to Nancy. Do you, in your space and in culture and people, have enough perspectives to deal with all these risks? Because the risk is that we parcel it out across the organization and it sits in little silos, and we do each individual bit kind of okay, but in the holistic way, we screw it all up.
Well, that's a loaded question. My chairman of the board over there. So I'm gonna know. So I say I don't know if we actually have enough perspectives when you try to look at all of it holistically. For what we're focusing on, yes, and that's why we've tried to be very intentional about finding the metrics that have the biggest correlation to achieve our outcomes through our mitigation efforts. So it's those pieces, but I do know there's definitely support from the organization when we see a gap and there's no expertise to weigh in. We will look out to the external experts to help assist us get there. So I think as long as the intent is there and to go about it without any malicious intent to kind of prove other groups wrong, you're in a good place to explore those pieces. And we're always learning. It's about listening, planning, learning, reacting, rinse and repeat. So it's all those things. It's a very sliding scale, if I could say. I feel that CDIC is in a very good position today. We are much smaller than OMERS right now, so we have a really good leadership team that can kind of lean in, and we do speak about these issues and what it means to the organization. And we're very fortunate to work with our risk function as well on those pieces. So I do think parts of that are, you're going to get a different answer depending on the organization you work for, because I think it's embedded in the culture as well.
Go ahead, please.
My question's around metrics.
Sorry, could you speak up a little?
My question's around metrics
Yeah, thank you.
and risk appetite. So all the metrics you've been talking about are backward-looking metrics. And it really doesn't talk about how much risk you're willing to take on for people risk. So do you have any forward-looking metrics around people risk? And are you able to establish what the risk appetite of your organization is, other than a 20% voluntary attrition rate or that kind of thing?
So I'll just do a few because it is hard. So I would say with all risks, trying to figure out the real forward-looking ones and not being stuck in backward-looking and KPIs is the hard thing. So for me, it is to go back to some of the things that I was mentioning. Forward-looking things help you understand where you'll be in the future, right? Where should the puck be so you can get there? So things like understanding where you have key person concentration, because you know if something were to arise, if a scenario were to arise, how to manage it. Things like succession planning, so you understand where you have depth, and the depth of your leadership teams is, to me, a key risk indicator. Things like recruitment and thinking about even net promoter scores, but thinking about how you're perceived. So things like how you are perceived in the industry helps you understand in the future your ability to recruit. So as you go through, you have to think of yourself, what is it you care about? What is your problem that you're trying to solve? And if your problem you're trying to solve is recruitment, people don't want to come, well then we can talk about things like your brand. Are you going to the right places? And what's their experience when they arrive? So one of the places where, like retention, how fast do they stay? Well, that could be a KPI that judges HR's ability to do onboarding, but it could be a KRI, a forward-looking indicator, if you're thinking about how do you have to change your processes to do it better. So part of it's how you frame it. I think you hit the nail on the head, though, for every single one. Another one is monitoring mental health in the area and in the cohorts. Like these are kind of the more macro things that you can bring in, but it is the hard part. I interrupted Rodney. Who's going to jump in?
No, I think that was very good, actually. So I just want to say it's really hard. I think risk appetite is really hard. I think in operating risks and in the people area, it is really hard. And creating metrics is frequently backward looking, is what it actually is. I think that really challenge yourself, like I've always found is that like what behavior are you ultimately trying to create, even as a result of doing the risk work. and what questions are you trying to address, and so to me, focusing in on a few things and really doing them well, I'd really say understand the data sets that you have. For example, you can, if you do the people surveys, right, and that has a lot of tons of information, can you take that with something else and triangulate it to tell you something that might happen? Those are where things get really interesting for me. But I think if you're in a risk function, I think the most important thing I'd encourage you to do is to trust your gut and have a point of view and challenge. Because to me, many people know if there's a conduct issue happening or if there's a culture not taking place appropriately in an organization, but aren't empowered to speak up. So have the courage to challenge and have the courage to have a point of view.
You just made me think of something else, because that was so good. Because another thing you could do is around scenario planning.
Can you write this?
I know, I'm going to write. So Rodney had a really brilliant idea, and I want to expand on it. Because another great place, again, to talk about the forward-looking is scenarios. So when you have your people planning tightly connected with your strategy, when you're asking questions around, this is my strategy, well, what kind of skills will we need for it? Do we have those skills right now? Where would I go and get them? So when you do your scenario analysis around that's also how you can get some forward-looking people risk when you connect it tightly with strategy.
And go back to, like we're talking about succession planning, and people talk about their high performer and their key talent. Go back and look, well, okay, well, Rodney left, who took his role? Were they identified as high potential, or was that all, well, something completely different? I think you know the answer to many of those things. So that tells you whether the process has actually, you're right about succession planning, is it actually robust and is it actually doing something meaningful? So that goes back to what I think in the risk function is have the courage to have a point of view.
Yeah.
Don't be reporting. That's the number one thing I said in our group, have a point of view.
Do you find that people risk it's harder to have a point of view and to speak out than in other areas?
Well, I also had the compliance
I
function.
think everyone has a point of view on people risk.
I think it's
Actually.
I think it's working in tandem with the human resource group, because again, the challenge I find in our human resource group was a business wanted to say, oh, it's your problem, like but it's not. You are creating the tools, as you quite rightly said, to mitigate this risk. So it's really having the relationship where you can actually truly explore and say, what do we think is really going on here, and is this meaningful? And
that holistic oversight
Right.
of the view of people risk. Everybody owns the people risk and
Right.
as people managers, right?
Yeah, because if you don't, it just becomes a compliance and a check the box.
Yeah.
And then you have turn. It doesn't work.
Well, thank you all for sharing. It's really, really great to have all of you and our audience here to have this interactive conversation on how to manage people risk. We shared some of the results from the people risk survey, and the publication on managing people risk is on our GRI website. So if you go to our GRI website, there is under the recent publication, and we are having a survey at the end of this session. Let us know what you think, and feel free to continue the conversation in the post-summit reception. Hope you can join all of you guys for some drinks and some treats and continue the conversation with the speakers. I want to thank you all once again, Nancy, Carolyn, Talia, and Rodney, for really sharing your insights and time with us today. And most importantly, thank you all for being part of this conversation. And really, I think together we need to remember when it comes to managing people risk is the adaptability we mentioned, is the collaboration, is the innovation, technology we all mentioned. That will be our allies, and really together we can shape and get the people-focused future for our organizations. Thank you once again for all of you to join us today, and hope to see you again in the sessions later and at the receptions afterwards. Thank you.
I'm quite jealous of you.